Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Hall, and today it's a conversation with the legendary Teri Fahrendorf, the longtime brewmaster and founder of the Pink Boots Society. She's here for a wide-ranging conversation about her career, brewery safety, recipe development, creativity, and forging a path in the beer industry. First, please go visit allaboutbeer.com. There you can find original articles, reviews, news, insights, and podcasts. Listen to shows like Brewer to Brewer and the All About Beer podcast simply by searching All About Beer wherever you listen to shows. This show and all of the work we do, it's supported by you. Please go visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to help keep the content fresh. A few bucks goes a long way to fund writers, photographers, creators, and editors. Again, that's patreon.com/allaboutbeer. And if you'd like to learn more about advertising on this show or any of our podcasts, please email info@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of that, this episode is brought to you by the Best of Craft Beer Awards. Attention brewers, registration is now open for the 2024 Best of Craft Beer Awards. Now in its 10th year, this is a BJCP sanctioned event judged by fellow brewers, professional judges, and industry leaders. It's judged in Oregon, and it's the third largest professional brewing competition in North America. It's also a chance to have your hard work evaluated and rewarded. In addition to traditional styles, new this year is the smoothie sour style category and the collaboration competition. Learn more and register your beers through January 31st, 2024 by visiting bestofcraftbeerawards.com/register. After a storied career in beer, Teri Fahrendorf recently entered a working retirement. She's helmed breweries, judged competitions around the world, and she founded the Pink Boots Society, which she then ran for nearly a decade. She's been a safety advocate, an outspoken critic, historian, and sounding board in her more than 30-year career. After countless brew days and then a turn selling raw ingredients, she's focused today on her art, crafting pottery from her studio in the Pacific Northwest. It's another creative outlet for this one-time computer programmer who forged a career through determination and will when the craft brewing industry was still in its infancy. She joined me in early January 2024 to share some stories, insights, more of which can be found on her blog and website, which is terifahrendorf.com. She isn't leaving beer completely. She says she still plans to judge competitions and stay involved in various other ways. But for the first time since the 1980s, beer is not her primary job. And this seems like a good time for an introspective. Here's our conversation. I know this is well-worn territory, but since you haven't been on this particular show before, and as you get into this working retirement that you're in right now, I'd love to go back to the beginning, however brief or long you'd like that to be, and ask you what drew you into the beer industry to begin with.
Well, it could be a long story or a short story, and I will try not to make it too long because I tend to apparently love to talk about my history. So, honestly, I come from a German-American family, and I was raised in Wisconsin. And beer is a part of the culture.
You had no other choice. That's it. Yeah.
Beer is a part of the culture. Had I known in high school that you could go into beer as a profession, I probably would have gone into that first. But that they don't allow beer people into high schools, which I think is a real problem, because when you encourage someone to go into the beer industry, you're basically talking STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. And what is wrong with that? And add on top of that business, because beer is a business too. So we used to have beer with pizza nights at home every now and then. I remember as a Girl Scout, we got taken on a couple of tours. I remember a tour of a McDonald's. I also remember a tour of the Miller Brewing Company. Which one do you think had a bigger impact on me? Definitely the brewery tour. Yes. And I remember being 9 years old. This was a long time ago, and we got a dime for weekly allowance, and we went to the church rummage sale, and I found a little booklet, probably put out by Miller Brewing Company, on how beer is made, and I bought it for my dime. And I was pretty excited, and I got home and I looked at it and I was crushed because it said you needed mash presses and all these big machines, and apparently beer was only made in a factory. Well, as we now know, beer is not necessarily made in a factory. But that was what I thought at 9 years old. So fast forward to college, I made homemade wine in college. Fast forward some more, I landed in California at a job as a computer programmer in the 1980s, and wine was pretty cheap, so I switched to homebrewing beer. Homebrewed beer for about 3 years, and by then I was really tired of my cubicle life as a computer programmer. I don't sit still well. I really like to be on my feet moving around. Cubicle life is just really not my thing. Although I've done it multiple times, but that wasn't working for me. But back in those days, you had to wear a suit to work. So you saved up money and you bought a suit on layaway in those days. And when you had 5 suits, one for each day of the week, then you could save money for a vacation if you had a little money beyond your rent, your car payment, and your student loan payment. So I took my first vacation in 1988, but it had to be inexpensive. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to attend the American Homebrewers Conference. It's in Denver. My sister lives there. I can stay with her and borrow her car. So at that pivotal event in June of 1988, I met certain people, Charlie Papazian, Michael Jackson. Those are the big famous ones. Greg Noonan. I met John Meyer, who was then the brewmaster at Alaskan Brewing Company in Juneau, Alaska. Later, he became a very famous brewmaster at Rogue Brewing in Newport, Oregon. Any rate, and in addition to attending the Homebrewers Conference at the time, the Great American Beer Festival was included in the conference registration. So all of a sudden, they're like, everybody who attended the conference is attending this Great American Beer Festival. 1988, it had only been going on, I think, for, I don't know, 4 or 8 years, not very long.
No, not, yeah.
Not very long at all. And so, so the judges back in those days, there was only a handful of them, and they brought the judges pitchers of beer off the floor. Nobody bottled and sent beer earlier. And at the end of the GABF, all of the medal winners got on stage together at the same time. That I'm talking all of the GABF medal winners. There's about 25 of them or something got on stage at the same time. And one of them was Melly Pullman. And she's about my size. In fact, she's exactly my size because we've met. And she was the brewmaster at Scherf Brewing Company in Park City, Utah, making Wasatch ales after the Wasatch Mountains there. And she won a medal. And I thought, if she can do the job physically, so can I. And when I was speaking to John Meyer, he had been a home brewer as well. And he had also been an aircraft engineer at Hughes Aircraft in Los Angeles. And I thought, if he can go from high tech to brewing and survive financially, so can I. So having these role models, which is really important, and we'll talk about role models later when we talk about Pink Boot Society, but to me, it's so important to basically see someone else doing what you want to do, someone you can identify with, that you can envision yourself in their shoes. And so having figured out that if John Meyer can do it financially and survive, and Melly Pullman can do it physically and survive, I could be a brewmaster too. Wow. So I made my decision that weekend before I even went home that I was going to pursue a brewing career. And John Meyer and another person that I had met had attended this school in Chicago called the Siebel Institute. So we did not have the internet then. So the only 2 schools that I knew about that taught brewing, one was the Siebel Institute in Chicago, and the other one was University of California at Davis, UC Davis. And at UC Davis, it would have been a master's program. They didn't have their other programs then. And I had a degree in business and computers. So to attend UC Davis, they were both going to cost about the same amount of money. UC Davis, however, would have taken at least 2 years because I would have had to catch up with food science courses, whereas the Siebel Institute was 12 weeks, super expensive. In fact, attending the Siebel Institute cost the same amount as my entire student loan from my 5 years at university. So,
Wow.
yeah, so yeah, writing out that check was actually it cost exactly half as much as my entire university, everything from university, exactly half as much. And so I put my student loan on delayed or whatever, and I had a little bit of money saved, and it all went to Siebel, and I had nothing left over. But at least I could get out of Siebel in 12 weeks and start looking for a job, so I would not have the lack of income for 2 years that UC Davis would have required.
Yeah.
So I got out of school, and there was only, as far as I know, 4 craft brewer types who attended Siebel before myself. I attended Siebel, and the night before classes started, they had a little get together so the students could meet each other. And we all went around meeting each other. And the question that the other students kept asking me was, "What brand do you brew?" And my reply was, "I don't brew brands, I brew styles." And every single one of them said, "Styles? What's that?" And so I thought, oh my gosh, because everybody but me was coming out of a large brewery. And
Interesting. Okay.
yeah, I was paying my own way, and 2 guys who had been laid off when the Stag Brewery in Bellevue, Illinois had shut down, they were paying their own way because they wanted to get jobs at Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, which was right across the river.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else was being sent by their companies, so they all were like going out to eat, because they were on account, on an expense account, and I was not. So I stayed with an old college buddy who had just bought a condo in Chicago, and he had a spare room. And so my room was a blanket with a sleeping bag on top, a lamp on the floor, and then I had a cardboard box turned upside down, and that was my desk, and where I could study for Siebel. I had no furniture. So I borrowed a car from my parents that winter, or for those 12 weeks, I should say. It did snow. And I attended Siebel, and I started organizing things. I said, you guys are a brewing school. Are we going to do class brew? I mean, do you have like brewing equipment here? Oh, we have some 5-gallon equipment. I said, can we make a class brew? And they're like, yeah, sure. What do you want to make? So I thought, well, I've always wanted to make a lager because I did not have refrigeration equipment at my home brewing, with my home brewing equipment. And honestly, I had only homebrewed 15 batches, and they were all extract batches with some augmentation from grains, from caramelized and roasted grains. And one of my friends who was an all grain brewer, you said, you have to come over and all grain brew with me before you go to Siebel. And I said, okay. So that was it. So at any rate, and I asked them, do the instructors know how to brew on it? Yep. I said, great, because, I don't have that much experience with all grain brewing. So I asked the class who wants to brew with me. And a few of them did. And so they said, what kind do you want to make? And I thought, oh, geez, I really like Celebrator Double Bock because, of course, this was back in the day when imports were king.
Oh, yeah.
And so I thought, I want to make Celebrator. So I said, how about a double bock? And they'll go, sure. And I thought, oh my God, they've never had one. This is going to be rough. So I brought in the Celebrator double bock, and I said, try this, see if you want to make it. And one guy on my team said, he was from Southern Illinois, and he said, this tastes like goat piss. And I said, first of all, you don't even know what goat piss tastes like. And second of all, it does not. And I thought, well, double bock is out. And so
at least he had the animal right.
Yeah, you're right. Oh my God, goat piss. And so then I thought, well, we'll make an Oktoberfest Märzen style. And we were heading up to Schreier Malting for a tour, which is now part of Rar Malting. It's their plant, Rar's plant. Mm-hmm. And Kurt Decker, who was our instructor and was then the president of Schreier, he gave me some Munich malts. So we made a class brew. I also organized a Beers of the World tasting. So I went to the local liquor store, which is where you bought imported beers in Chicago, and I bought up all different styles, and I held a Beers of the World tasting for my class because I thought these people cannot go to Siebel and graduate in 12 weeks with no knowledge of world beer style. This is insane. So, at any rate, everybody came and they all were shocked. That was fun. And then also there were three brew pubs in Chicago at the time. I don't remember the names of all of them. The only one that survived that time was Goose Island, and the other two didn't. And so I organized carpools, and we all went there. So then when the instructors said, oh, you guys have to pick a class president, and my Canadian friends were then friends with mine from Molson. They said, we're going to nominate you for president. I said, I don't need to be president. That's like an ego trip. I said, I'll be vice president. One of you guys be president. They said, no, you're organizing everything. They said, we're going to nominate you. And the guy who said that Doppelbock tasted like goat piss, he ran against me. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And he was voted to be class mascot. So there you go. And I was voted in as Siebel's first female class president in Siebel history. Woo! And that was the first of many firsts that I have had in my career. So it's been an amazing career, and that is how I ended up in the beer industry. It was basically attending Siebel, and I thought, worst case, I can fall back on computer programming, but by golly, I don't want that. So I worked really hard to make sure I could get into the beer industry. And if you want me to go on from there, I can. Otherwise, I will turn it back over to you, John.
I'm just amazed that for as expensive as Siebel was and prestigious as it was, you come in with all of these ideas and they're like, sure. And it sounds like it almost never occurred to them for half of these things, or to have the equipment, or to have it sound knowing Siebel as I do now. And I haven't taken classes there, but I visited, and I've spoken with countless graduates over the years. It seems like they were lucky to have you when they did.
Well, I'm sure I've had an impact there because I'm sure they started doing the Beers of the World tasting after that. At the time I attended, 1988, you have to remember, it feels like to me in my memory that there were about 50 regional and national breweries in the United States and about 50 craft breweries. I swear those are the numbers, although I know that's not true. The average IBU in a beer was probably 10 or 12. 10,
Yeah.
11, or 12. I remember that Siebel at the time was also an analytical firm, and I would always stay after class and study in the library there. And because, I mean, a lot of the things in the class was not really on the level I could really relate to, because they were all basically, let me say this, at the time, the Siebel diploma course was a finishing school kind of for people who already employed in breweries. So at the very beginning of Siebel, like in the 1880s, the diploma program was a 2-year program because nobody went to college back then, hardly anybody. So the breweries had to actually pay to send whoever they wanted to be brewmaster to attend Siebel for 2 years. And it was literally their version of university. By 1966, and I know this because I met a brewmaster who attended in 1966, it was a 6-month program. So Dale Brew was at one time the brewmaster at Walter's Brewing Company, Leinenkugel's Brewing Company in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. And because I had gone to college up in that area, I later went up there for a tour, because when I went to college, I didn't have a car. So I went up there while I was at Siebel, and I called the brewer, and it was Dale Burrow. And he said, I attended Siebel in 1966. It was a 6-month program. He said, I had, maybe an associate's degree. He didn't have a college degree. And so that was what you did. By the time I attended in 1988, it was a 12-week program. And I remember the instructor saying, oh my gosh, we have this beer. It was the hoppiest, most bitter, most IBU beers we'd ever seen. I thought, what was it? Anchor Liberty. It was 45 IBU. It's 4 times as much as any other beer on the planet, they were thinking. It was shocking to them. If you remember who David Ryder was, he was the R&D brewmaster at Miller for many years. But before that, he was actually the registrar at Siebel when I attended there. I mean, we're going way, way back in 1988. So, they weren't getting, well, they did get a lot of students from overseas, but not from Europe. The international students that were there was one of my friend from Guatemala. I met him there. There were people from Panama and Seoul, Korea, and India, but mostly Asia and South America. Coors had some people there, but Coors couldn't afford for the time for them to be gone for 12 weeks.
Sure.
So they would send them for 1/3 of a class each year for 3 years. And like there was a fellow in the class and he was the packaging manager, but they wanted to move him up into upper management. But he had worked his way up in the packaging department. All he knew was that I'm putting liquids in packages and I got to keep it sanitary. He knew nothing about beer. He did not know how beer was made. He knew nothing. So that's what the breweries would do. They would send a guy like that who worked his way up from like the factory floor practically, and then they wanted to put them into upper management. They would send them to Siebel as a finishing school. Siebel had nothing to do with the craft beer industry at the time compared to now. As I said, there were 4 people in the craft beer industry that attended before myself. I mentioned John Meyer. Dan Carey of New Glarus Brewing attended before me.
Mm-hmm.
Jamie Emerson from Full Sail Brewing attended before
sure.
me. And a guy named Don Outerson, who was involved with some breweries in Cleveland, and now I think he's with a distillery. Those were the 4 people who put themselves through that came out of, let's say, the home brewing world and did not come out of the national and regional beer world in the United States. It's very different now.
Yeah. So with that in mind, right, if you have all of these larger breweries sending, existing folks in through this program,
Mm-hmm.
and you were not cut from that cloth, once completing the degree there, what was the job market like?
As I mentioned, they were, in my mind, about 50 craft breweries in the United States. Now, I had always wanted to live in Oregon ever since I was a little girl and learned about the Oregon Trail. I have no idea why, but I always wanted to move to Oregon. In fact, I would talk about Oregon in college, and my roommate had a T-shirt made that said Oregon or bust, like the old Canada, whatever, the old wagon trains. And guys would ask me in a bar, does that mean you want to go to Oregon or you want to get a bus? And I thought, well, that's kind of crude, buddy, but whatever. And so, I don't know why. Sometimes I wonder if our future self sends us secret messages about where we need to be for our best future. And maybe my future self was telling me, you're going to be the right person to be in Oregon someday. So anyway, I wanted to go to Oregon, and I was living in California. And so I got out of Siebel, and I had packed up all my stuff in order to go there. I was basically gone for Labor Day weekend at the beginning of September through Christmas. And then I came back, and then looking for a job in January in the craft beer industry in 1989, that would be then. Not so many of them around. So what I did is I took my my old 1985 Honda Accord, which I drove for 22 years. But I took that and my pet bird and a suitcase, and I had a coworker that lived in Portland, and I drove from the Bay Area to Portland, and at every single brewery that existed, craft brewery that existed, and every single homebrew shop on the way, I stopped and dropped off a resume, and what I said was, if you know of any craft brew, they weren't craft breweries then. We're going to have to redefine
the microbreweries,
craft brewery, okay? it wasn't about, I got to talk about craft breweries for a second. It
Okay.
wasn't about the beer. It was about who made the beer. So part of the microbrewing movement was sticking it to the man. We made beer they didn't make, but it was really about the scrappy small business owners, not about the beer. And so once though some of those small scrappy microbreweries, it was beer. It was beer or beer or beer. It was beer from a microbrewery. And once those small breweries, some of them got so big that they didn't feel micro anymore, well, they pushed to change the name to craft brewery. But when it becomes about the beer, anybody can make it. It's just about, do the big breweries want to make it? I mean, it only costs them not much more than their regular beer. It's all about the marketing and the packaging for them. So, anyway, so I kind of wish that we had kept that term, microbreweries. And besides the fact, if all beer is craft brewed beer, it's just beer.
Well, yes.
So anyway,
I've made that argument in the past, but I agree with you. But
yeah.
yes.
So anyway, I visited every craft microbrewery. See, they got me programmed now. Every microbrewery and every humber shop, and they'd say, "We're not hiring." I said, "That's okay. If you hear of anybody opening a new brewery, a craft brewery, a microbrewery, please pass my resume forward." And so I made everybody take it. So, and then when I got to Portland, where I was hoping to end up either at Eugene or Portland, I asked all the breweries in Portland to give me a informational interview. I mean, it's January. Everybody's small. I mean, at the time, what was it? The brewing company in Mendocino Brewing, what was it? In Hopland, California, Mendocino Brewing Company. I mean, they were like 500 barrels a year. Everybody was so small. And so, and of course, they say they're not hiring, but I just want to find out, what are you looking for?
Yeah.
So I ended up um, I ended up I ended up down in Berkeley, California, at a brewery that they had gone out of business through bankruptcy. Some other people took them on, whatever, bought it out of bank. Were trying to bring it out of bankruptcy, and the general manager there received 2 copies of my resume, and he didn't know it was a physical job, which was the beef everybody seemed to have back in those days. And he figured he said, "You come highly recommended. I got 2 copies of your resume." I'm like, awesome. And I was the only one that had brewing school, because I mean, when I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, I belonged to a homebrew club called the San Andreas Malts, and they just celebrated, I think, their 40th anniversary last year. And I was the only woman club member who wasn't somebody's spouse. But they about 10 of us went pro right around that time in 1988, 89, and they all could do it without going to brewing school, but I figured nobody would hire me without brewing school, because sometimes you got to use your brain over your brawn, and people just, they didn't have confidence in my ability to do the job. So it was great. I learned a lot at Siebel, but I ended up at Golden Gate Brewing Company in Berkeley that went out of business two months later. It's a long story, won't go there. But that's fine, because I landed on my feet over at Triple Rock, and Triple Rock was phenomenal. That was the best brewing school I could have asked for the hands-on knowledge that I gained there. And from there, after a year and a quarter there, I was able to get a job up in Eugene, Oregon at Steelhead. So I finally made it to Oregon.
I love that. It, it seems like throughout, like there were paths available for anybody who is willing to put the work in, and I think that that's probably still true for brewers today. There's just more options or more places where you can put that. But I mean, the hurdles of back then were just, I don't know. You must have conversations with brewers today about now versus then. And you created a path for so many um, brewers that followed you. But um, I, in thinking about those early days, um, would you start over again? Would you still do it?
Oh yeah, it was the best time of my life. I mean, yes, sure there were hurdles. I mean, there weren't very many breweries, but also a lot of people who loved home brewing were making good money and weren't willing to take the pay cut that it took to go there. I mean, there was a major pay cut involved, for sure. And I mean, these people are all friends of mine now. But at the time when they didn't know me and I was looking for a job, I would get asked funny questions like, "Can you carry a full half barrel up a flight of steps?" And the thing is that women are very clever. We'll figure out a way to do it. I'm happy to see that people are asking better questions now, because the question shouldn't be, can you carry a full half barrel of beer up a flight of steps, or can you lift this 55-pound bag over your head into the grist hopper? The question should be, there's a keg of beer, it's full, it's the bottom of these steps, how would you get it to the top of the steps? A woman would figure out a way to do it that would be the safest way, and it would not injure someone's back. And not only could a woman of any size do it, but an old guy who's already wrecked his knees and his back from trying to physically, you know, whatever, finesse is the wrong word, but physically do the job by just, muscling through it all the time, a woman would figure out a way to do that. You want that grain from ground level up into the hopper? Great. I get some cinder blocks and some boards, and I get a 5-gallon bucket, pour half the grain into the 5-gallon bucket. I make 2 steps. The mill's not that fast. I could do it in the same amount of time.
Well,
So I always tell people that whenever people are asking if you can do the job their way, they're basically asking the wrong question. What they need to know is, what's the best way, what way would you do this job? And it will be the safest. And if you want to have a safe brewery, probably one of the smartest things you could do is ask a woman brewer to do a safety audit on your brewery, and to basically look at the way your your young physical guys are doing all the jobs that are wrecking their knees and their backs. So sure, but I will say that back then the breweries were small. Some had 1 brewer, some had 2 brewers. So there wasn't any breweries hardly that had like a staff of brewers. That was just unheard of. A staff of brewers meant that you were one of the big guys, or one of the big regionals or whatever. Pretty much everybody that I knew in the San Andreas Malt Homebrew Club who went pro that year, we all got jobs as head brewers, or brewmasters, if you want to call us that. And I do call people a brewmaster if they know more about beer than anybody else who works at that place. But some people nowadays are not comfortable with that term unless they've apparently studied in Germany for 4 years, or whatever, had 20 years of experience. But at that time, if you were a home brewer who went pro, you could call yourself a brewmaster if you knew more about beer than anybody else who worked there. And if you were the boss in the brewery, you were the brewmaster.
I
So,
yeah.
so we'd have ourselves or an assistant, and really, other than me, if you were a guy with some strength and you had a pulse and you knew and you'd been homebrewing for a few years, you could maybe get a job at a brewery. I mean, some of them were owned by the people who wanted to brew, and some of them weren't. But mostly, even the ones that were owned by home brewers, those home brewers who were the owners needed to run the business. So they would hire one of their friends from the homebrew club to actually do the brewing. It's easier to train someone to brew than to train someone to run your business.
I wanted to go back to something that you said, and that at the risk of phrasing this in an indelicate way,
Mhm.
some of the questions you were getting back then, you said that they were funny questions, but it sounds like in some cases they were also sexist questions, or questions that were dripping in misogyny. Is
Well,
that fair?
certainly the one about carrying a half barrel of beer up a flight of steps. The fellow who asked me that question is a friend of mine now, and and these guys are friends, and if I were to ever remind them of this, they would probably argue they couldn't possibly have said it. But at the time, they had never met a woman brewer. They had never heard of one, thought of one, dreamed of one, could visualize one, none of that. And so this fellow, there was a small chain of brew pubs, and so he asked me this question over the phone, and I said, no, I cannot, I could not carry a full half barrel of beer up a flight of steps, but nobody should, because that's 180 pounds just in the beer or something, I think
Yeah.
it was, not including the weight of the keg itself. So I would get a hand truck, and I could slide it up the steps with the hand truck, or I would get I would throw some boards down and make a slide, and I'd get a winch at the top and a net, and I could winch the keg up. I said, there's multiple ways to get the keg up the top of the steps. And he said, well, I'm sorry, but I require all of our brewers to be able to carry a full half barrel of beer up a flight of steps. It's not even worth us talking. Now, what's hilarious about this particular question and this particular guy is that 2 years later I'm brewmaster at Steelhead, because I was brewmaster at Triple Rock in Berkeley for a year and a quarter, and then I got hired up at Steelhead because I really wanted to get to Oregon, and I was there for the whole tank installation, construction, everything, and then I got all my beers ready to go. Meanwhile, they're finishing out the pub where the seating and the tables and the tiles and whatever, everything, the decor on the walls, the lighting. And so this guy was in town. And so I invited he and the local brewer from this particular chain over, because all my beers were already on draft. I said, why don't you come over and try my beers? They're on. And the guy came over, I'm sure thinking, oh, women can't brew beer, whatever. And he sat down, he tried all my beers, and he almost choked. And he said, wow, your beers are really good. I said, mm-hmm. I mean, my whole goal was they were better than his brewer's beers over at that chain, to be honest. And my whole goal among my career forever, because I am competitive, is to raise the bar. Wherever you go as a brewer, raise the bar, make better beer than whatever is being made there. Now, Portland's an awesome beer town, so I don't think that's possible anymore. But at the time in Eugene, Oregon, there was one other brewery, and we were the second brewery. Steelhead was the second brewery, and I raised that bar. And I had homebrewers coming in, and they were jokingly chiding me, saying, I used a homebrewer, and I got a kegerator, and I got these Cornelius cans, and your beer is so good, I don't think it's worth me brewing anymore. I said, well, bring your Corneliuses in. At the time, we'd fill them for $35 to fill a Cornelius. And so I had to bring in your kegs. And so there were more than one home brewer who stopped home brewing when I came to town in Eugene.
I like that. Um, you've brought up safety a couple of times. And I feel like any conversation with you needs to address, the utmost importance of safety in the brewing industry. And I know you've shared your story multiple times, but also been an advocate for other folks coming into the industry and being in the industry for best practices, and just ways of ensuring physical safety when working in and around a beer making space. How do you rate where we are with microbreweries, craft breweries these days, and safety? Is there? It's obviously leaps and bounds better than it was, but is there still a lot of work to be done? A little work to be done? No work to be done? What's your take?
Honestly, I'm not out and about visiting breweries as much as I was when I was doing beer ingredient sales. I believe that the massive growth that we saw between like 2009 and 2019, something
Sure.
in there.
Yep.
We literally went from around 1,000 or 1,500 breweries to 9 or 10,000.
Uh-huh.
A lot of times safety gets left behind when you see that kind of growth. Now, the fact that we're having a little hiccup in the industry and things have slowed down, I am hoping that people get around to the safety issue. If people listening to this don't know, I am a safety poster child in a way because I was severely burned at my first brewing job. And as some of you may know, Chris Swersey, who was the Great American Beer Festival judge manager and a former brewer for many, many years, he said, every brewer is a burned brewer. It may not have happened yet. And if there was a way that I could somehow wipe out all future burns from breweries, I would do it in a heartbeat because it is life-changing in the worst kind of way. So the fact that people have been burned, since I have been burned, I was burned in 1989. The fact that people have been burned and burned worse than me and died from burns tells me that we don't have it right. When let me think about this for a second. In 2007, I was on a big road trip. We could certainly talk about that later. And I spoke at the American Brewers Guild out in Vermont. And I talked about safety, and there was no deaths in the beer industry, in the craft, certainly the craft side of the beer industry at that point. And when I spoke about 6 years later, there were multiple deaths from safety issues. So let's just say it got worse for a while. Is it getting better now? I'm not sure, but I don't see people taking it as seriously as I feel they should. There's still people who are not thinking about grain handling when they're designing their system, and they're having basically, you want to touch and lift that grain as little as possible on the way in and the way out. Some people have thought about that. Some people have not. I'm not seeing as many, say, brew pubs and small breweries putting in silos, which definitely reduces your lifting loads. I'm not seeing as many people putting in augers. I mean, I saw a lot of small silos and augers back in the, say, early 90s and in the 90s. And then people stopped doing it and they just started buying bags. Now, part of it is that brewers got more esoteric about their raw materials. And so instead of using, let's say, one base malt for all their beers, no, I have to have German Pilsner malt for this beer, and I have to have Scottish Golden Promise as my base malt for that beer. Honestly, you can make really great award-winning beers with even using one single base malt. I'm sorry, I hate to tell you it's true. But the devil's in the details of the specialty malts, and those you do have to lift. So that's lifting issues, and that's a knee and a back issue. Burns, I mean, every brewery in this country could have a boil overflow device on their kettle, and what it does is that when the foam starts boiling up, as soon as the foam hits the probe, it makes an electric connection and it cuts off the gas or the electricity or the steam or however you are heating that kettle. Every kettle in this country, it should be mandatory, it should have a boil overflow prevention device that basically kills all the power. Also, another thing that helps with boilovers is kettle stack fans. Not only does it help with the boilovers, it helps with your beer. I mean, basically, if you're having DMS, which is a corn type of a flavor in your beer, then you need a kettle stack fan. And in every brewery I've designed, I put in kettle stack fans. Only one had the boilover prevention device, but that's because the boil was about 1.5 feet from my face. It was just a shorty little thing. And then there's other things as well. Augers can be mobile. They can drop down from the ceiling. I mean, there's a lot of ways to do that. Silos, like I said, small silos can fit on the roofs of buildings. You don't have to get 60,000 pounds. Here's the thing. Back when breweries were first starting, like in the late 80s, early 90s, nobody was trying to be the next Sierra Nevada, Sam Adams or whatever. I mean, everybody was just happy to have a brew pub and get top pint dollar and just make a good living at it. Then all of a sudden everybody wants to expand and they want to, oh, now we got to have all these tasting rooms, we got to supply all these places or whatever out of one giant brewery. Oh, and now we got to maximize, we got to have a great big space. And I'm thinking, you don't have to put in a brewery with that many tanks. I mean, I've seen a few in Portland that should have just been little tasting rooms, little tap rooms, little brew pubs or whatever, 10 or 15 barrel system. And I've seen them go in and I'm thinking, I know that brewer. Did that brewer want that big? The brewer might be a partner, but I'm thinking, I bet his money partner is either the bank or whatever investors said, go big or go home. And so they end up putting in like, I don't know, a 30 barrel kettle, even if a 15 barrel kettle, then 30, 60, 120, 90, whatever barrel fermenters. This is insane, people. There is so much built capacity out there, and there's not enough customers to fulfill that capacity. I mean, there's a lot of choices, folks. There's hard ciders, and then there's the packaging issue too, because that costs more. So I get it. Oh no, now to break even, we got to brew this much. Really what you want is a brew pub, sell your beer for full pint dollar on site. I mean, you can make good money that way just owning a brew pub. But you have to hire someone to run your kitchen. Sorry,
Yeah.
I got off track about safety there.
No, I wanted you to drive that home. Every time I see a social media post where brewers are like doing an actual brew day, not just posing for photos, and they're in shorts and their boots,
Oh my God.
I
Makes
think
me
of you
insane.
and I get freaked out.
Yeah, the safety issue that you walk past is the safety issue you're okay with. So if you walk past a ladder that somebody has like on a stool because they can't reach it with just the ladder, and you walk past it, you're okay with that guy breaking their neck then. You got to say something to somebody. If you don't want to save the person up on the ladder, then you go find their manager.
Yeah.
If you, and I see brewers all the time in like freaking Tivas and shorts, and I'm like, okay, are you accepting of a burn injury? Because as I said, every brewer is a burned brewer. It just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
So you want to make it easy for your burns to happen, or you want to make it hard for the burns to stick? You know, um, and like there was a guy who was like a friend or something or a relative of the brewer, and they said, here, go throw these hops in. Well, the guy threw in the hops in the kettle, and the kettle boiled over and killed the guy. This was like a visitor, for God's sakes. First of all, you don't have a boil over prevention device. You didn't check the kettle yourself and spray down the foam, and you don't have a kettle stack fan. What the hell is it you even having visitors in that brewery if you don't have those safety features? I mean, I could just go on and on
No,
and
I
on.
know.
Anyway, it's not hard to find the information. The Brewers Association has safety books and booklets. There's videos out there. Hell, you could just find me on Facebook, call me or something, and you could just tell me what you do and don't have, and I'll tell you what you need. But another thing to think about is that defining when I worked for a malt company, we were very careful of and learning about safety. So there's levels of safety. What can you do that's simple, and then how much does it protect you, and what's the next level, and there were like 4 levels of safety, and we had to basically rate every single task within the job. And in a brew day there's a lot of tasks on the scale, and then we had to discuss how to reduce them. I don't know if any breweries that are going through that much trouble, but in our little pilot brewery, we literally did this. And one of the tasks was it was a 1 barrel brewery, and the grist hopper was this little cylindrical thing that you could fit maybe 100 pounds into, and had handles, and then 2 people were supposed to lift it on top of the mash tun. And then there was like a hydration collar where the water sprays into the grain as it's falling right beneath that. So you hook up your hose and your pump or whatever. And so the safety guy said, nope, not good enough. he said, find another way. So he did not want two people to lift this thing. And I'm like, okay. Now, every brewery that's starting up does not have a guy that says find another way. But I thought, okay, well, the only other way I can think of is we need an auger because, we can't lift. We're not supposed to lift. You're really not supposed to lift anything above waist height. Okay.
Right.
For safety. And so this thing was filled at waist height with the grain, but then we had to lift it higher than waist height to get it on top of the mash tun. So I thought, okay, we'll get an auger. So what I had is I had a little portable auger made, and it was awesome. And the hopper was at the same height as a rolling cart. So we put the bags of grain on the rolling cart, and they came off the shelf, which were all about waist height. So the grain was stored at waist height, went onto the rolling cart at waist height, and then it was just opened up and then tipped into this thing, everything at waist height. And then the auger augered it up. It worked like a charm. And so, you know, I suppose I should be like a safety consultant for small breweries, but I don't want to go there.
I hope that every brewer listening right now is furiously writing down notes about how to improve their spot. I want to switch gears if I can.
Yes.
To obviously the pink boots and where the organization is now versus what it was when you had the idea for it to begin with. But like how it lives in your mind with what it's become.
Okay. Well, I should tell your audience a little bit about what it is and why I started it, maybe just because they may never have heard of Pink Boots Society.
If they haven't, shame on them. But yes, okay, please.
Well, I'll be brief. So, Pink Boots Society is basically an organization. It started as a list of women brewers in 2007 when I was on a road trip across country. I blogged it at roadbrewer.com, and it was basically a 5-month trip where I visited every brewery that invited me pretty much. And during the weeks and on the weekends, I'd visit mine or my husband's relatives or whatever. No real vacation. And I blogged the whole thing because people kept asking me for email updates, and I figured I don't want to do that. And I didn't know how to write a blog, but I figured it out. And so on the first week when I was on that trip, I did stop at Stone Brewing, and they said, you're going to work with Laura Ulrich. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was a Laura here. And she had never heard of me. Now, at the time, I had been a brewmaster for 19 years. And I had been running Steelhead, 5 locations. We'd won 24 Great American Beer Festival medals, and people hadn't heard of me. This woman had never heard of me, and I had never heard of her. And so we were chatting at dinner, and it became real clear to me that she needed to connect with other women. Now, most of my life, I've had men friends, and there's times in my life where more of my friends have been male than female. And so I was perfectly at home having all male friends, but not every woman is like that. And, I just pretend I don't understand the crude jokes, and I pretend they went over my head. We all get along great. But other women might take some of those jokes personally and feel out of place. And so I just felt like Laura needed a mentor. And by golly, I wanted to mentor her. And her question to me was, Teri, you tell me that there are other women brewers out there. How many of us are there? And I said, I don't know. I'm going on this trip, and I will count to the best of my knowledge. By the time I got to the East Coast, another woman asked me the same question, and I had an answer. 60 women on my list. And this was from people telling me, oh, don't forget, Sister Doris in Germany. And so there were a few international ones on that list too. And that woman said, really? 60? Who are they? I want to know because I want to talk to them. I want to network. I want to contact them. And I was like, oh, is that where that's going? So I put the list up on my website. And then I got home from that trip. And then soon enough, there was a craft brewers conference happening in San Diego where Laura was the first woman. And I called her months in advance, said, hey, the craft brewers conference is going to be down in San Diego in your neighborhood. Should we try to get the 60 women on the list together? She said, yes, let's do it. She and another gal down there organized it. It was amazing. I had male beer writers and journalists such as yourself asking, can I attend and cover it? Because a group of all women brewers was going to be totally historic. And I said, no, send a woman, because we don't know what it feels like to have a room full of estrogen in the beer industry, and we need to feel what that feels like. So we met, and the women were so excited, and we were tasting each other's beers. I noticed that the dialogue about the beers was very different from what I was used to in a room that was all men. And so they had a podium and a microphone. So I said, hey, ladies, we're going to vote on some things. I mean, this was all kind of spontaneous. I didn't know they were going to have a podium and a microphone, but I took advantage of it. And we're going to vote, they said. I'm like, yeah. I said, do you want to be a list online or a group, or what do you guys all want with this Pink Boots thing? Because by then I had named it. And they said, they voted, they passed around the microphone, we talked, and they decided to be an organization. And I said, okay, I don't know what that means, but I might need help, because it sounds like more work than just trying to find names to put on a list. And so I said, second question, who are we, ladies? And they said, well, Teri, look around. We're women brewers. I said, look again. There are 6 women beer writers in this room, and they have all asked to join. And I said, and I have received emails from other women in the beer industry, a lab manager, a female lab manager, and a female packaging manager, among others. So there was quite a bit of discussion, including should men be allowed to join this organization. And when they finished voting, they voted that we stood for 3 things: women, beer, professionals. Now, what's interesting is in the 17 years going on, let's see, we started 07. Yep, 17 years this year that Pink Boots has been around. Those 3 things, we have redefined them. So women has now been expanded to women and non-binary. Beer has now been expanded to all fermented beverages: beer, wine, sake, cider, kombucha, spirits, and any future fermented beverages I haven't thought of yet. Somebody will probably invent it. Those are all in there. And then professionals it used to be if you just earned some money on an ongoing basis, $5 a month would be fine. Now that's been redefined, that we need you to have some skin in the game to be considered a professional. You can't just sell a couple of beer cap earrings on Etsy every month. Basically it has to be 25% of your income. And so that is how Pink Boots Society has changed. And I think it's great. Obviously we've had more of a background with beer, so more of our members are beer. We're at over 2,800 members. I got some new, here's the thing, I'm not on the board of directors. After 9 years of running it, mostly by myself with the help of some volunteers, I fired myself because I was really burnt out. And as I had mentioned once to somebody, that I am more of an artist than an administrator, so I knew I wasn't the right person to grow it. I consider all the Pink Boots members my children. So I have over 2,800 daughters, which is pretty awesome. And Pink Boots is my first daughter, so that's pretty awesome too. And a lot of ideas come from the membership. The members who were in beer, but then switching over to wine or kombucha or cider or whiskey or whatever, they're like, hey, I want to maintain my membership. How can I do that if I'm not in beer? Well, we have to think about that. Then we expanded it. We've had members who have changed their genders. Great. You can stay in it. As long as you stay a woman. Actually, if you're a male who has transgendered into being a female, great. Well, then you're fine. It's usually that direction that are our members, of course. Anyway, chapters came out of the membership desires too. They're like, hey, I want to hang out with my local members, but I don't really know who they are because I can only connect with them online, but we want to get together locally. We want to form a chapter. So the first chapter was formed in Northern California. Alexander Noel, who's now at Three Weavers, I believe it was her idea, or
Mm-hmm.
her and her chapter. So the San Francisco area chapter was the first chapter, as far as I know, and now there's like, I don't know, 80 or something in about 40 countries. And we have members that don't have chapters, but I mean almost every country is represented. China, Palestine, Israel. We probably have members in Ukraine, all the hot spots.
I love that. And it's just the way that it started, and to have a global movement like that now. It again, it sort of seems like right place, right time, and right idea, and right follow through in that moment.
Exactly. And we had some dead ends for us. We took on education right away. At our second meeting, which was during the Great American Beer Festival in 2008, we had 35 members attend that meeting. And I said, well, let's vote again. And so we voted to become a nonprofit and to raise money for scholarships because, I after we decided to become an organization, I went home and I have this couch, I call it the thinking couch, and I lay down on it because I was like, oh my gosh, what does it mean to be an organization? I mean, I've never did this. I don't even know who to call for advice. So I didn't call anyone for advice. And it's not like I could say, oh, it's just like that organization except for beer. Or, oh, it's just like that organization except for women. There was nothing like Pink Boot Society at the time. Now there's Pink Boot Society. Other groups can say, oh, it's just like Pink Boot Society except for Black, beer industry professionals or whatever. There are other organizations that can point to Pink Boot Society as kind of a guideline. But as I said, I'm not an administrator. It took 4 years to get the 501c3 tax exempt nonprofit status from the IRS because I am not an administrator. My mother-in-law helped me write that 98-page application. But also I thought, okay, if we're going to become an organization, if we just throw a party every year, okay, here's the Pink Boot Society having their annual party and whatever, one, if we charge admission, what do we do with the money? And two, if we just have a party, it's just going to fall apart. So I strongly felt that we needed something, a goal that was bigger than all of us, that we could all get out of that cart and push it uphill. That we could all get behind. And so that's where I came up with the scholarship program. It started with 6 scholarships. I think 2013 was the year that we finally got our 501c3, and I was able to to solicit money that would be, tax deductible for the donors. And so I put on my thinking cap once again, and I said, okay, we're going to have 6 scholarships. We have at this point, who knows how many, 200, 500, however many members there were that year. And how are the other members going to benefit from the scholarship program if they didn't get a scholarship? First of all, we never call the people who receive a scholarship winner, because that kind of makes it sound like the other women who applied are the opposite of winners. And
Sure.
there are no losers in Pink Boot Society. Trust me on that. They're go-getters. And so that's where I came up with the Pay It Forward program, where if you receive a scholarship, you have to agree in advance that you will pay it forward somehow. Now, I think big. When I'm on that thinking couch, I'm thinking really big. That's why Pink Boot Society is worldwide. That's why we have a Pay It Forward program to benefit not just the other members, but my goal is to benefit all of the beer industry as a whole. So my goal with that was that the recipients would pay it forward by writing a speech that they could give at the Craft Brewers Conference or the Master Brewers Conference or another conference, or they could write it for publication and get it published in New Brewer Magazine or Brow Belt or whatever. So as you can tell, if you think outside the box of what I'm saying right here, my goal was to fill the pipeline of speakers and writers with women so that there would be role models for everybody to read from and see and listen to. So I mean, it's a big picture thing. And so that is what's happening. I mean, I wouldn't say all the pay it forwards are happening at the Craft Brewers Conference or in New Brewer magazine, but Pink Boot Society now, thanks to Laura Ulrich, the woman that I mentioned from Stone,
Of
she
course, yeah.
became, yeah, she became the second president of Pink Boots after me. I ran it for 9 years. She ran it for 5 years. Bless her heart. And she was the one, she and the board at that time came up with the idea for a conference. So we have a biennial conference every other year. There's going to be one this June in Philadelphia, I believe it is.
Oh, cool.
And anybody can attend it. We have had men attend the conference because, and I asked the guy who came to one of them, I think it was Austin, I said, just got to ask you, why'd you come to this conference? He goes, one of them was close by. I could drive to it. And he said, two, it's a heck of a lot cheaper than the Craft Brewers Conference. And he said, honestly, the quality of the speakers and the content is off the charts. And I'm super pleased with it. So the Pink Boots conference, all the speakers are women, and they're pretty much all Pink Boots members. And a lot of them are doing their pay it forwards. And the pay it forward is not, tell me about your whatever your educational program experience, whatever you attended, your class experience. No, it's pick one thing in that class that really intrigued you. Let's say it's the Krebs life cycle in yeast. Okay, take what you learned in that class, go do some outside research and write a paper on it, or write a poster for the MBAA National or whatever. But as the Girl Scouts say, we are creating tomorrow's beer industry leaders today through Pink Boot Society. And I want to see someday that those leaders of our beer industry, that half of them are women. And Pink Boot Society is doing that, dang it.
So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was brewer creativity and where it was when you first started versus what it was throughout your brewing career, and then maybe what it could be. But it's interesting to hear that question that you got early on of what's the brand you brew, when people weren't even talking about styles, and then obviously the style explosion, and then where we are now. But I wonder if you could just sort of walk me through where you see the importance of a brewer's creativity, which I guess also is part of the commitment to the craft and the science and the quality and all of that.
And the art.
And the art, yes.
Well, back in the day, information was really, really hard to get. So you were just like, if somebody got a source or something, you're like running to the library to make copies of it. At one time, I had a collection of every article that mentioned microbreweries or microbrewing or microbeer out of every newspaper I could find. I had like a 3-ring binder. There were like hardly any articles. They were hard to find at all. And so I collected them. And Fred Eckhart up here in Portland did Listen to Your Beer, a little newsletter.
Oh, yeah.
And once in a while you would run into an issue of that and you're like, oh my gosh, I got an issue of this. And you subscribed to Zymergy. I don't even know if New Brewer magazine was going at that time. And so information was really hard to find. There was, is it called the Dearden Park Homebrew Club? There was a homebrew club in the UK of old guys in London or thereabouts, and they were historian homebrewers who would go to like the Bass Brewery or the Whitbread Brewery or whatever old breweries, and they would look through the old brewing books. They were allowed to look through the ancient brew logs in the libraries and historical files of these breweries that have been around for centuries. And then they would convert those recipes to home brewing size, and then they would publish these little booklets. So I had one of the booklets, Byron Birch and the essentials of home brewing, and then Fred Eckhart's The Essentials of Beer Style. It was so difficult to find any information. So as far as creativity back in the day, um, we as homebrewers we were unafraid, just like homebrewers are unafraid now. But our homebrewing was like, oh my gosh, we're going to use a bittering hop for dry hopping and see
Mm.
what the aroma's like.
Yeah.
So that was kind of mild mannered. And then there was reproducing ancient styles. So you couldn't go to the store and buy an India Pale Ale. It wasn't there. Liberty was probably the closest thing we could find, but really the first modern IPA that I ever had was mine. I brewed it based on the information I found in Fred Eckhart's The Essentials of Beer Style. And he mentioned Munich malts and Vienna malts. Now, I had formed a philosophy in my head that I would only use American ingredients because we didn't really talk about it much, but the first brewery that I was employed by, I had an injury there. I had my burn injury
Yeah.
because of some lack of training in a very poorly designed brewery, and they bounced my paychecks even before the injury, a whole bunch of craziness. And so I thought, I don't want my owners to go out of business because of the beer ingredients. So I always used American ingredients to keep my costs down. And the quality did not suffer. I mean, Steelhead earned 24 Great American Beer Festival medals. That's nothing to sneeze at.
No.
And so and so so then you would get ideas. You're like, okay, I'm going to use Chinook for dry hop because I love that hop as a dry hop. And I'm going to make an India Pale Ale, and it needs to be about this strength. It needs to have these malts. And this is what I read in Fred Eckhart's book. The hops that it used were East Kent Goldings and Styrian Goldings, and the flavor they're getting is orange marmalade. Now, I had already restricted myself to American ingredients, so how am I going to do that? Well, I'm getting some grapefruit, pineapple characteristics from the hops I'm using, which at the time was Chinook, Centennial, and Mount Hood. Mount Hood hops. I never used Cascade in an IPA, and I never used any crystal malt. Crystal malt does not belong in an IPA, in my opinion.
Hmm.
And there was a big phase where everybody's putting crystal malt in their IPAs except for me. And now I don't think anybody puts crystal malt in their IPAs again. But and
Again,
it's
I hope
funny.
brewers are furiously taking notes.
It was so thank you. It was so funny because my friends who had come out of homebrewing as well, they're like, "What? You can't make an IPA with American ingredients? That'd be like making a German Pilsner with American malt." And I said, "Well, I'll do that too." And they're like, "No, you can't.
Huh.
You have to use German malt in the Pilsner. You have to use British malt in the IPA." And I'm like, "No, I can't because I've made myself this restriction because I never want to go through another business of another brewery going out of business. It's horrible." And anyway, so as far as I know, at Steelhead, I was the first brewer anywhere to put an American IPA on draft as an everyday standard flagship on draft every day. And that was January 22nd, 1991. And that was way ahead of Bridgeport or anybody else who was making American style IPAs. And it was called Bombay Bomber IPA, and it had a cult following, although it never won a Great American Beer Festival medal. And what I told people is I said, you can't put a tiger in a cage and expect it to behave like a wild animal. You cannot put my Bombay Bomber in a bottle and expect it to taste like a Bombay Bomber with that grapefruit and pineapple aromas from those hops. And people come in and say, how do you get those aromas from the hops? And it was a fluke in a way, because Dan Carey, who I previously mentioned as the
Sure.
brewmaster and owner at Nuclearis Brewing Company, at the time in 1988, or actually this was in 1990, he was working for JV Northwest, a tank manufacturer based in Portland, and that's where the tanks that were coming to Steelhead were being made. And Dan Carey spec'd our system, and he spec'd an oversized heat exchanger, and I could knock out 10 barrels, knock out meaning chill it. I could chill that 10 barrels down to pitch temperature in 10 minutes. So a barrel a minute through the heat exchange, and then pitch my yeast. And I used a wide yeast. It was 1768, not 1968, and it was a Fuller's yeast from the UK, from London. But it was not the same route. So this was a friend of a friend had a culture, and then a friend gave it to me. And then I put it through 3 batches at Steelhead, including a rye beer. And I figured now it's going to have my house character. And that was the yeast that I used. It'd be great if anybody wanted to start using 1768. I now give you my permission. I won 24 Great American Beer Festivals with that yeast, so it's no snoozer.
Yeah, it's no slouch, yeah.
Yep. And so for creativity, you would come up with ideas. Like I came up with this idea that I really wanted to do grains of the new world. And so what grains are grown in North and South America? And after I did that, perhaps I would go to like South Africa or something, other new world, not Europe grains, and do a whole series of beers with that. I didn't get very far. I got to amaranth and I got to wild rice. But that's as far as I got with that one. But that would have been a fun, seasonal specials. I mean, a lot of people, there was a while in like, the 2000s, 2010s, where people were opening breweries and doing, I'm never going to have any flagships. I'm only going to do one-offs. And I don't know if that's such a great idea, certainly not anymore. And people may be turning away from that. But I think it's good to have your standards, whatever they may be. And I also think it's important, because this is just my creativity, that every beer on a sampler sheet looks a different color. It should look different, not just smell different. I mean, I've gone to breweries and I'll get a sampler set of 6 and they're all yellow. And I'm like, seriously, didn't we move away from that? I mean, I want to see a rainbow, because you drink with your eyes as well as with your taste buds, and every beer should smell different. You can use the same yeast if you want to. You could push it with different temperatures on the same yeast and get different yeast aromas. I mean, for a while, their yeast was kind of the new hops, right? Because hops were, in short supply. So people were experimenting with yeast, and I think that's wonderful. Different acidity levels. I mean, there's so many ways you could push yeast. Yeast is so much more creative than wine. I think the winemakers are jealous. Winemaker can maybe blend different varietals, but then it's almost forced to be called a blend or a table wine. And I often buy the table wines or the blends because they're often better than the straight varietals, because they allow the winemaker to actually have some creativity and say, oh, I'd really like some commonality, bring in some of those, deep red colors and some of those bolder characteristics. And I'll take some Cab Franc because I need a little earthiness in this particular wine. And so, when you're out there buying wine, buy the blends, because, oh my gosh, some of them are so good. And but that's what we get to do as brewers that other beverage professionals don't get to do, is that we get to experiment. There are so many hops out there, and there's so many combinations. There are so many malts out there, and you can stay within a country for your malts and make it work. You can stay with only a few yeasts or one yeast. I mean, for good, proper yeast management, you need to be using that yeast all the time. You can't just let it sit in a can in your cooler. I just don't think that the quality is going to stay. And you can really push those yeasts with temperature. Heck, you could even do some yeast blends if you wanted to mess around with that. Nobody says you can't. There are none of those kind of rules that some of the whiskey producers and the wine varietal makers have to contend with. You can mess with your water. There's a lot of information out there on water. I've been super fortunate wherever I've been brewing has had really good water, especially Eugene, Oregon, where I spent most of my career. The water out of the faucet there is just sweet and delightful. It comes out of the Mackenzie River, right out of the mountains. All they do is let it filter through some sand beds and add a little bit of chlorine. But if you're a brewer, fill up your hot water tank, let it sit overnight, and the chlorine dissipates. It's gone. And so by the time you brew with it, there's no chlorine in that water. As far as today, the brewers today, certainly where I live in Portland, Oregon, are outstanding, super creative. Oftentimes they make so many seasonals that a lot of the seasonals are one-offs. And a lot of the one-offs, honestly, I'm not criticizing anyone because I can't even think of who I would criticize because they're all so amazing, all these brewers. But sometimes I'm just saying a warning that sometimes your one-offs are just not going to be that good. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it takes a while to refine your beer. I mean, the first Bombay Bomber I made was 8.1 ABV. I mean, people loved it. They got wasted on it. And so what I did is I dropped the amount of pale malt by just taking less pale malt out of the silo, but I kept all the specialty malts the same. And when I adjust a recipe, that's what I would do is I would only change, I never change, once I hit upon what I wanted for my specialty malts, I would just change the amount of base malt. I wouldn't change the amount of specialty malt, and I could just fine tune it from there. Another thing that brewers need to keep aware of is that your suppliers know a lot. So if you're I've known people, let's say, that are buying imported Munich malt and making, say, a dunkel with 100% imported Munich malt, and it's really, really expensive. And I recommended to this one particular brewery. I said, you could target the same color. It's simple math, and try using basically some of the non-imported, maybe dark Munich malts, some of the really dark Munich malts, and we could have a whole program on how malt is made, but you should probably talk to somebody who's actually still working in the malt business for that. But I used to be able to really explain to people how malt is made, different styles of malt, and how they're made is what basically gives you those styles of malt. And so, because there's only about 5 different ways for the most part that malts are made. So a Munich malt is going to be different from a crystal malt, and a dark Munich malt might not be called Munich. It might be called something else, like melanoidin or something. So I recommended they try some base malt. That gets them onto a silo if they ever want to do a silo, and then some of the darker Munich style malts. And I said, try phasing in a little bit of that just so you can cut back on your expenses on the imported stuff because, breweries are struggling now. They can't be paying all this money for imported malt, no matter how amazing they love that imported malt. What's more important, being like specifically regional specific about your raw materials and their source, even if it takes like a giant carbon footprint to get them here, or to just make the same thing with local ingredients that taste amazing and get it as close as your yeast, which you can make locally or whatever, get, source locally, as close as your yeast and your water can get it. When my friends, the homebrewers would give me a hard time about making IPAs with all American ingredients, I would tease them back and say, are you actually getting your yeast shipped from over in Germany or the UK? No. Are you importing your water from the UK? No. I said, well, then what's wrong with using American malts and American hops if I can get as close as possible as I can, which I did, and it became a whole new style, American IPA. So back to the creativity part of it. So
Yeah.
so at any rate, so I, you have to balance things, use your creativity and go hog wild with your mind on how you want to design, say, a beer or something, but then bring in the realistic part. If you're not the owner, think about, would you rather have your next pay raise, or would you rather use all imported ingredients? You know what I mean? There was a fellow in a large city out west here, I'm not going to say where or whatever, but he was the brewery name was his last name, and because of that, I think he felt really attached to every beer and how it came out, which you should, whether your last name is the name of the brewery or not, right? But this is where he was coming from. He was coming out of home brewing. And when you're a home brewer and you walk into a homebrew store, you see all these different bins with all these different kinds of malts on it. You think it's like a Crayola crayon box, and you could just play with any of these crayons, which is true at the homebrew level, because all those crayons are created equal at the homebrew level. But when you want to scale that, and this fellow wanted to scale up, and he was buying malt from one of the smallest producers of malt in Europe and the UK, that area. And so he wanted to scale up, and I said, it comes in 55-pound bags, and that's it. Can't you get it in a silo? And no, you can't. I mean, it's a small producer. One, are they even going to be able to give you as much as you need for what you want to scale? I had a brewer who was jumping from a 3-barrel kettle to a 60-barrel kettle, which is a huge, they're not around anymore. Neither is the other guy. But I mean, that's just kind of an insane thing. And they were so creative when they were 3-barrel, and they were having so much fun. So they were very popular, and they decided to scale up to a 60-barrel. And he said, well, don't you have all these different malts that you sell? I worked for Country Malt Group. Okay, I'll admit that. And we sold imported malts. Don't you have all these different malts in silos over there? And then you guys just use different bags to bag them up? I said, no. I said, each country has their own bags. Each malt producer has their own bags. Those bags are bagged over in Europe, dude. And then they're coming over here. He goes, well, I want to get a silo of it. I said, you can't. And so what I'm telling is the small producers, and even if you're a home brewer who wants to own a brewery someday, if you think you want to scale up at some point, you need to maybe talk to your supplier before you get locked into your recipes and say, someday I want to scale up. This is the type of beer I want to produce. And, what are the best substitutions that I could do this? So I'll go back to the local person who was using all of these German malts in their Dunkel, all this German Munich. And I told him, I said, just bring it in a little at a time. Well, he decided to do an experiment because they had a tap room, and he was just going to make one batch with all the domestic malts and zero of the imported ones. And he figured he'd just put it on, see if anybody said anything, and then he could just say, oh, it's a seasonal. Well, he put it on. Not one customer said a word, not any of his accounts who were like pubs. Nobody said a word. He said, Teri, nobody noticed. And I'm like, mm-hmm. And so he was able to reduce his costs a lot. People are so funny with their suppliers. I had a guy who lived in the coastal mountains in Oregon, and he was ex-Vietnam vet, and he would only have this particular imported British Maris Otter malt, and he said, I need it tomorrow. I said, I'm so sorry, I'm putting in the order today. It'll get put on a truck tomorrow. You won't get it till the day after that. He goes, well, can't you helicopter it in? I'm like, dude, this is not Vietnam. We don't have a helicopter. We can't helicopter a pallet of malt up to your mountain, garage where you're making this beer. I mean, people are very funny. So there's a balance with the creativity. If you're a home brewer, I want you to go as crazy as you can. Every Crayola color of malt in that homebrew shop is the same. You go for it based on your budget and what you want to do. And if you want to put a roasted malt and chocolate and raspberries and ginger into the same beer, you go for it. I don't know if it'll sell. Nowadays, probably it would.
Yeah.
But if you then open a brewery, and as I said, these people who are insist it has to be imported, be careful, because your beer is really important to you. It's important to your customers. Your customers may or may not be able to taste it, even if they go from one pint to the next pint, just like that one brewery noticed, of the same beer, but with different ingredients. But the survival of your business is super important, because here's what happens. people take on their breweries as if they were their kid. And I have seen more marriages dissolve trying to keep that brewery alive. It's not your kid, you know. If you're going to open a brewery, make a written agreement with your spouse that you will sacrifice the brewery before the marriage and the family. Do it. I'm not kidding. And that is part of why I never opened a brewery, because I knew I would take it too seriously, and I didn't want to sacrifice my marriage and my family, you know. And you can, and also know that if you own a brewery, you are probably not going to be the one brewing the beer, because it's easier to train someone to brew your beer than to run your brewery. And if your brewery is struggling, you will train someone to brew the beer, and you will run the brewery, and you will get out there and sell that beer, because nobody can sell beer like an owner. Nobody.
All right. In the very few minutes that we have left in this conversation, and I feel like we could be going for, I don't know how many episodes. Like we could make an entire season out of this, because with your experience. But in the very few minutes that we have left on this episode, at least, I wanted to ask you the green door question, which is there's a television show called The Good Place. And in the final season, they introduce a concept of a green door that the characters can walk through and be anywhere doing whatever they want to be doing. And so if we had a green door on our plane of existence and this conversation ended and you could walk through it and be at any pub or any brewery anywhere in the world, where would you like to go? Who would you like to be with? And what would you like to be drinking?
I would like to go to the Timothy Taylor brewery in the UK and drink Landlord right there at the brewery, because I have never done that, and I have a friend who has done that, and he's raved about it for years. And apparently it's about 3.5%, but it has more flavor than you can imagine for such a low alcohol beer. And I think I would like to sit there for an afternoon and talk to all the people that work there and all the regulars, and just have one hell of a afternoon.
I love that. So I know you have a working retirement. You're still going to be out judging beers and hopefully at events in the beer space now and again, in addition to working on your art. But I hope our paths cross in person, at least at a judging table, in the near future. And thanks for doing the show this week. Thanks for all of the insight, all of the perspective. It's super important for the industry right now. So I'm deeply grateful for your time.
My pleasure. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
As always, you can get in touch with questions, comments, and guest suggestions. Just email me. It's John Hall. That's JOHNHOLL at allaboutbeer.com. A reminder, go visit allaboutbeer.com. There you can check out the podcast page, the merch page, and read great new content, as well as the archives, which go all the way back to 1979. You can also follow All About Beer on social media at All About Beer. And if you're interested in supporting journalism in the beer space, and I hope you are, email us at info@allaboutbeer.com. And please consider going to patreon.com/allaboutbeer, where a few bucks really does go a long way to help fund writers, editors, photographers, and content creators. Here, before we go, is a quick word from this episode's sponsor, which is the Best of Craft Beer Awards. Registration is now open for the 2024 Best of Craft Beer Awards. It's now in its 10th year, and this is a BJCP sanctioned event judged by fellow brewers, professional judges, and industry leaders. It's judged in Oregon, and it's the third largest professional brewing competition in North America. It's also a chance to have your hard work evaluated and rewarded. In addition to traditional styles, new this year is the smoothie sour style category and the collaboration competition. You can learn more and register your beers through January 31st, 2024 by visiting bestofcraftbeerawards.com/register. Before we go, don't forget, All About Beer has a podcast channel now. Search and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. Steal This Beer has new episodes every Monday, and the BYO Nano podcast comes out on the 15th of every month. As for this show, Nate Schweber does the music, Jeff Quinn designed our logo, and I'm John Hall. New episodes release every Wednesday, and that's when I'll be back again to drink beer and to think beer.